Welcome everybody to Decolonising LSBU Series Episode 2. London South Bank University, LSBU, is on its starting journey to decolonising transformation of university curricula. As we move forward, we decided to share our LSBU journey through a video podcast series, and we've called it Decolonising LSBU. Decolonising the curriculum is about centering the minoritised and marginalised groups, not only the knowledges, but who is delivering what and why, the pedagogies, assessment modes, the resources, literature and otherwise, and many more. Decolonising the university is a methodology to transform the university. It's a lifestyle change for the university to disrupt the recycling of institutional racism and discrimination that impacts minoritised students' abilities to belong and hence be successful. And this is for minoritised staff too. So for episode 2, we are going to showcase some of the decolonising work that is going on around the university. And here we have our lovely panel. I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves and then tell you a bit about their work. And hopefully this is going to be an interesting presentation and discussion for you all. So I'm going to start with Luke first. Thank you very much, Luke.
Thank you, Michelle. So I'm Luke Song. I'm a film lecturer at London South Bank, and then I specialize in cinematography. Put it plainly, it's just lighting and camera in the film production. And today I want to talk about the decolonizing cinematography education, experimenting with light ratios and textures for Black and Asian skin tones. So this experiment and also a research project that with my students is trying to figure out how students can really work with non-canonical materials, and they can learn from totally different art traditions. And the idea behind it is like this. Cinematographers are trained to control and measure the relative differences in brightness between two parts of a scene or purely on a face. And then all these kind of differences is decided for expressive purpose. Painting is often referred to for inspiration, as practitioners learn to compose and represent light and shadow in a sophisticated manner. But it is noteworthy that the painters generally studied by filmmaking students are mostly from Renaissance traditions and then produce work featuring predominantly white models. The gap of racial representation in pedagogy is stark and has been long overlooked. Then my research, this one, just trying to extend inquiries into the lack of diversity in cinematography educations, examining how different aesthetic traditions such as Asian ink paintings could pave new ways for decolonizing the conventional conception of the lighting ratios and the textures. So I'm going to draw on qualitative and quantitative case studies, working with my students, hopefully can really let them work in the studio space, safe, and they can practice, they can do whatever they like. However, this time they are not going to work with the traditional Renaissance painting. They're going to find other paintings from different cultures and use that as an inspiration to do work. And specifically ask my students and also present my students to come to studio, work with the Black and Asian models. That's just by comparing the learning outcomes and the current industry techniques for optimizing screen representation of BNE groups. My research hopefully can evaluate how students respond to learning from modern artwork, and then they also can promote diverse identity. This is basically the abstract of my research stuff. And then so we started probably from some basic understanding, because you probably hear me talking about some keywords such as lighting ratio or the textures. So lighting ratio, to put it really simply, as you probably can see from my face now, I'll have one side is brighter, one side is darker. And then this kind of ratio, if it's two sides are the same brightness, I code it 1 by 1. And then this, of course, if it's going to be slightly darker, this side probably is 1 by 2. And if you can imagine, using your imagination, when the darker side getting darker and darker, that will go to 1 by 4, 1 by 8, etc., etc., etc. And this is kind of we cinematographer trying to understand some language. We can communicate with everybody and knows that what kind of feeling we want to create by this kind of differentiation. For instance, if you remember some kind of film noir or some crime thrillers, generally speaking, the characters or your protagonist or even antagonist, their shadows sometimes will be extremely sharp. And then that's why we tend to use 1 to 1 by 8, that kind of the differentiation, light to dark, as a certain type of tone. However, just give you a very quick thoughts-provoking questions. Imagine if it's a black model, how can we differentiate this type of the balance, as if we are talking about using white models like a general reference? So that's the starting point of this whole thing. And then another thing I want to break it down is about painting with light, because everybody in cinematography domain or in this trade of work, we always thinking that we are the painter, but what we do is we paint with light. This poetic phrase somehow is already not outdated, but everybody's still using it to inspire young students. But what kind of painting we are referring to? And then if we are talking about painting, what exactly is in the painting itself as a subject? So I just thought that if we really look into this kind of rhetoric or the way we discuss the cinematography, there are so many things still have a very strong sense of putting white subject or white people's life as a reference or a base benchmark. Then, of course, you probably can see that in the world cinema traditions or academics, all the studies have been questioning the hegemonies or trying to figure out that is there any other way to understand the different cultures, and then we can bring in different narratives and put them into the center. And then painting with light, this kind of idea has been challenging a little bit. However, not many people are still using a more systematic way to understand other ways to decipher this painting with light. So this is also another starting point. We talk about the lighting ratio. If we using different skin complexions models, this kind of basic mathematical calculation might not work, because how we're going to see their different sides of the face, there's no codified expression can be defined. And then the second thing is the painting issue. If we're trying to figure out is any other painting tradition can be used in modern cinematography, there's so many questions can be asked. That's why in my research, first of all, I let my student to dive into more different world cinemas. For instance, a very famous film called Shadow is directed by Zhang Yimou, a very famous Chinese director who did the Heroes, and then also other really good well, I will talk about this later because I will use that as an example to explain to you what exactly he achieved. Also, I would like to use a black artist, Lynette Yaden Bioki. I think she's also very important for the discussion because she's the one trying to using her style and create the black subject into a totally different expression. So these two become my main source to showing students how you exactly can understand the lighting ratio and then the painting textures in the different traditions. Then I ask my students to come into the studios to use their own exploration and their research and trying to duplicate something they want to achieve, working with the Black and Asian model. Just a heads up, because we try cinematography education, we of course will encourage students go to a museum, go to see some paintings, but they always duplicate those white models, framing, and then composition and lighting. But this time, the thing is, I want to go slightly more beyond that, and then make sure that students can understand when they really trying to photograph a scene or people, they are not like something they can simply copy and paste in the studio scenario, what exactly they should do. And this kind of practice will make them to be aware of the diversity in the real world. And of course, in the later on, when they go on to the professional set, there are so many stories and subjects. It's not only about white people, they can be mixed, or they have different type of the people in the same frame. How you're going to have this extra care and then the attentions to those details in order to make your image very pretty. Now, of course, just this disclaimer, because I think beauty, pleasing, pretty, these kind of terms is somehow I would say not problematic, but it needs to be unpacked. And then we have to study from a slightly neutral point to get it right. So please just be aware that when I using these terms, I also love you guys to really think the beauty, whose beauty it is, and then who defined the beauty, and then what kind of beauty is being established, and then probably never been challenged. So this is just so many layers things. If we just purely thinking about cinematography, even though it's a science, it's a technique, it's a skills, but there's so many underlying theoretical or philosophical or even ontological things you can stop and have a look and stare at it and see the nuance, and then you can find a way how you're going to understand them or doing your research. So after the workshop, what I'm trying to find out is I do some questionnaires, ask the student to do, asking how their perception about the teaching content and then their workshop experience. And also the most important thing is their self-initiative research when they're trying to define what kind of Asian or Black artwork they want to bring in the studio to do. And then it's I'm really pleased to see that the students responded all this kind of things in a very positive way. And then I can give you I do some very simple 1 to 10 scale. So the average scores for the content learned in the workshop is 8.64 out of 10. And for the content learned from the lecture is 8.42. And then the most important thing is the benefit of learning from their own research is produced by the Black and then the Asian artist is 9.35. So after this kind of information, I feel that in film education, we have this idea of the community of practice, because that means you encourage students to really form their own communities, and they can really learn from whether they shadow the professional or they learn from each other. They have the sense of the doing things and building up their own resources. So I think they really figure out that if they really feel empowered, if they can be encouraged to do all their own research, and they can use that research to try out with the Black and Asian model. And then they really find out that this kind of the things they learn a lot, instead of the lecture, just telling them this is the thing you do this way, and that's the thing you do this way. What they enjoy most is the steps they really take on their own. They find out something, they find the questions, they discuss between themselves, and then they try to do that in the studio, lectures, then discuss with them what kind of thing they can be improved. So I think that's my research. The whole journey is I let students to see the problems or something is missing. Then students to figure out what they want to engage more. And not only individually, they also form their groups to do things together. They share the experience, they identify the problems, and they even discuss how they're going to do it in the studio. Then, when they come to the studio, we have this community become bigger because lecture is also present, and we can really working with the Black and Asian art modules. They really see the real issue there when they have the limited resources, but they want to achieve what they want to do. This kind of circle make things very rewarding, and student has a really strong positive feedback on that. So I think my research is somehow combined with this qualitative and the quantitative. I don't want to dive into the detail, but there's some, some numbers, and then their feedback. I can cite it in my future presentation, or if you are interested, my article will be out very soon. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Luke. That was tremendously engaging. I've got so many questions, but I'll save them for later. But thank you so much for sharing that with us. The next person is Maria.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure, to be part of this discussion today. And, because I'm an architect and I work at LSBU teaching the division of architecture, which is, within the School of Built Environment and Architecture. And I teach, at master's level, history and theory of architecture, history and theory and critical thinking, and also architecture and theory dissertations, which, the dissertations at that level is 10,000 words. So it's an extensive piece of work, and students have really to commit, to primary research and produce a substantial, written piece of work. Because I'm an architect, I have chosen to take you for a city tour. So the weather is great. Imagine we are walking along, Thames. We are at South Bank, and we see this, building that I'm sure you have noticed, OXO, the OXO building. So you walk there, and just before you walk there, you're curious, what is this OXO thing? It's because, in the 19th century, it was the place where the extract of meat company was manufacturing the OXO beef stock cubes used for cooking. So it was like a processing meat, processing animals. So it immediately, gives you this kind of relation between human and the animal that is also colonized. So it's not just about, Black people, but our relation to our environment. Of course, River Thames, the other side, and I will discuss this in a bit. But as you walk in and you approach, the entrance, you see that there's an exhibition, which is the end of the year architectural exhibition of LSBU. And you walk in the first floor and you meet, your ears meet, the voices before your eyes meet the video. Actually, there are these three voices discussing decolonizing architecture teaching. So this year we have in public domain the video of the conference that happened in January in LSBU on learning and teaching conference. And then at that time, I invited two of my students that had successfully completed the dissertations to have a discussion and present, at the conference. And because, the visibility of this work we did at the conference was, as always, conference, they have limited public visibility. Then we decided to upload this on YouTube, on LinkedIn, and other platforms, but also, to have this in a prime location this week, and if you have the chance to go and visit the weekend. So in this exhibition of the history and theory, the theme is thinking, because it's not enough, to decolonize the curriculum, include, more topics that relate to race, to gender, to our relations with, the environment, animals, etc. It's, the way we think about, what are, like the preconceptions that are seated in the way we think about all these issues. So the installation has the title, The Thinking Room, and you go in and you are asked, to leave your preconceptions aside and actually try on your brain a different way of thinking. And the dissertations are, like, because we didn't have, we don't want to print because of, climate change issues. So we have this first page and the abstract of its dissertation, hanged from hangers, very cheap ones. So that's, the way I teach, in a sense. It's not just, to produce a dissertation, but how you are, as a student, you are challenged, to change your thinking, and how what you produce becomes, almost, public knowledge. It's publicized. So in terms of the discussion in the video, which you can find on YouTube, and there's a QR code that one can use and go and watch the video. It's about like the work of those students that the one work on the human-animal relationship in the design of London Zoo. So how, designing specific, type of building kind of revives or embeds, preconception about the relationship. The other discussion is about, methodologies, because it's not enough, you have different topics, but also how you approach these topics. So students experiment with other, methodologies that are not, like reflective ones, which, presuppose that, there's an existing reality out there, which you represent somehow, and you discuss it. And this reality is pre-existing and stable. But, students are encouraged to work with diffractive, methodologies, which is feminist, methodologies, where you think about, the attachments and the fluidity of attachments between different actors and different entities in the world, and how this produces, the built environment. So, and then we have, this year, and I don't want to say this because what I'm about to say, it reproduces, this colonizers thinking. So excuse me for that. So there's a very bright, black student that produced, the best dissertation, trying, to see a historical building, which is very well known, Hampton Court. And through, diffractive methodologies, feminist theories, and also, understanding magical, thinking, but in the sense of, the re-enchantment of the word that, feminist, thinking, has put forward. And looking at the building not as an architectural, object that you study the history, the forms, the typology, but understanding versus if you see, like the dining room, you have the table, and you have, the of course the architectural configuration, but also you have the menu and of, like specific time in history. And then, the menu leads you to the outside of the Hampton Court, the animals that are consumed, the territory that is attached to this building. Also, he looked at the archives and all these archives of building master builders. What material and who built that. So and there's another one on Thames, and because usually if you do a dissertation on the River Thames, and it's an architectural school, you look at, like the architectural front that faces the river. But actually, if you take the river as an complex assemblage of, the water, what comes into it, sewage, but also, the people and the humans and the animals that are related to it. And if you think that today, because of climate change, challenges, legal rights are assigned to rivers. So what if we were to assign, legal rights to Thames? What would be the implication of thinking about, the river and its assemblage as something that has agency, actually? So this might sound, very removed from, the strictly, rational issues in decolonizing the architecture curriculum. But, just to summarize, it's important to see what we teach. And of course, what we teach in architecture is dominated by the architectural canon. So what buildings from which geographical region are included in our history and theory books. And of course, this goes back to the kind of history of classification, scientific classification and taxonomy that creates hierarchies. So what is, like to be included and why there's, a reasoning and thinking about, taxonomies and classifications. So one aspect is, and the easy one is to apply this kind of inclusion principle. So you include more, buildings from different geographical areas, or you include, more architects that are not in the white male category. But is this, the answer to the problem? Of course it's not, because if you reproduce the thinking of the canon, it doesn't really matter. It's, again, like an inclusive canon, but a canon nevertheless. So in a sense, we need, to think also, and I take this from, Luke's presentation and the establishing, the criterion for beauty. Here, again, for architecture, we have kind of a rich, tradition of thinking about the ideal body. Usually, there's a male body, from Leonardo, then, to Le Corbusier's modular. There is, like you build for a body. What is this body? What are the needs of this body? So nowadays we are thinking about, like the design of, of all, genders or, bodies as well. So that's, again, goes into the inclusivity principle. So then we come to the question, how do we teach? So we need, to have this non-reflective methodologies. I mean, reflection is really good. It's a scientific method. You cut off an object and you observe it, and you are the subject, and this is the object. So it's, the relation is established immediately with the cut off and observation. So how we can, help, students and ourselves, mainly ourselves in the university, to understand that there are more ways, to do research using other methodologies. And then, of course, how we teach for architects is also, not for architects in the university, is also quite complicated by this kind of teacher-student problem and the hierarchy there. So how do you teach without reproducing this hierarchy, but still, teach, So my approach to that is that I ask students to make use of their intelligence and understand, their potential and capacities. And, that's why also I didn't use, the work of students for the conference, I invited the students to discuss. And the reason they are not with me today is because they both work. But we did also the exhibition together, so their names is there, and they were involved in the exhibition. So I try, not to reproduce this kind of master-slave, because this is, dominating architecture schools. And actually, there's a big row now at a very well-known London architecture school, a famous one. The dean stepped down because there are all these complaints about, harassment of students, the culture of the design studio, the way, they speak to students, sexual harassment, the kind of slave approach, to students. Because there is this demand of producing research, tutors have to produce research, they exploit, the work of students as well. So that's something, to produce, research outputs through their teaching. So that's, very complex issues. And then, of course, so how do you decolonize this kind of knowledge exchange within the university in the way we teach? And then there is, of course, the complex relation between education and practice in architecture. So again, this year, because of, that's the last thing.
Okay. Sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah. Can you just start that again? That last sentence.
The last sentence, which is, like how we decolonize the knowledge exchange in the way we teach in architecture and university in general. And, the last thing is, the complex relation between education and practice in architecture. And again, this year, because of Black Lives Matters and the decolonizing, kind of imperative almost, now, there was a big row in a very famous school in America where, well-known, teachers that were also practitioners were fired because in a meeting with all school, they reproduced this kind of stereotype of master and slave. So architects, young architects should, toil and be slaves in the studio, but also in practice, work for very low wages. And, the teachers reproduce this addressing, students at the university because they were both, practitioners and teachers. So, and of course, the master builder and, the slave force being that, cheap labor of, young architects or, actually, the labor force that, is invisible of, the people that do the work, and build, these impressive, buildings in our metropolis. This is part of kind of decolonizing discourse. So many issues. I hope, our university will take up all these issues, especially in the School of Built Environment and Architecture, where, architecture is seen as just a technical thing, and how you, of course, if you are to work and have, fundings from the industry, you have to be conservative. You can't challenge. So it is a possibility for the architecture school in the division in the Built Environment Architecture division to have a different approach and challenge, the thinking. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Lots of layering around topics of colonialization and the colonizer coming through in your presentation. And I've got quite a few questions, but I'll stay to one later on and ask you that question. But thank you very much, Maria. Next, we have Tracy Davanna.
So I'm going to be reflecting on a second year level 5 module entitled Policing and Society here at LSBU. This is actually my second year teaching it, and I inherited it shortly at the start of last year, following my joining LSBU as a full-time criminology lecturer. So I've sort of spent the past year really, thinking about the decolonisation issue, process, and the overwhelming significance of it. Now, this is part of a conference paper I submitted to the Equity and Education in Society conference this summer. And I sort of began to consider colonialism's enforcement and reinforcement of knowledge producers and systems and styles of pedagogy, and how politics enters every curriculum, regardless of the subject, but also in particular, when it comes to criminal justice system and teaching the criminal justice system, it is there with a capital P for politics. So, for example, in relation to policing and society, our local police force to LSBU is the Metropolitan Police, which seemingly just seems to be entrenched in misogyny and racism. So it's important really to say that in decolonising this module, it takes an intersectional approach that recognises the burden placed not only on people of colour, but women of colour. But there's also a need to understand the complexity of these different lived experiences, which is revealed in a number of young Black women who will be taking this module next academic year, who also seek a career in the Metropolitan Police. So what I'm going to do is, because it's such an important issue, and it can actually be pretty scary to start the whole decolonisation process. So I'm going to contextualise the initial steps I've taken, reflecting on the history of the Metropolitan Police Force and that discourse that we hear. And also, this need to reflect on my own biography, that of a white middle-class woman who lives in a village in East Sussex that experiences under-policing. So, like I said, this is contextualised the history of the Metropolitan Police. And when initially considering how to decolonise the curriculum, for me, an important starting point became the content and in particular the basis for our historical understanding of centralised police forces. Because modern police forces have emerged from white colonialism, and that misrepresents their role still to today in society. So far from this romanticised image that we're often presented with in relation to community policing and in this country, the role of the Bobby on the beat, the police were never founded to prevent crime or protect communities. Instead, they protect wealthy property owners informed by colonial experiences in Ireland that enforce social and political structures of the ruling classes. So just a brief history of the Met. They were the first centralised force of its kind in the world, founded in 1829 by Robert Peel, who was the then Home Secretary. Prior to this, there was a range of different localised policing in place called the Watch, and that was made up of various individuals, some professional, some less than professional. Peel drew on his earlier experiences from Ireland in informing on the centralised police force that was, he felt, required in the UK to quell growing social unrest that was underlined by poverty. In Ireland, the British Army had often been used to crush similar social unrest, although, as you can imagine, it was a fairly brutal hammer for cracking an egg, with soldiers often firing into crowds and creating martyrs as a result. Peel responded by founding the Royal Irish Constabulary, which obviously later included the infamous black and tans that were used in the Irish War of Independence. And this was a much more cost-effective means of maintaining British colonial rule. As Alex Vitale, author of The End of Policing, writes, it not only helped maintain law and order, it also created widespread poverty, famine, and displacement. Now, Peel then brought this experience to London when Home Secretary, the backdrop being once again this growing unrest caused by poverty and changing employment practices that even saw bread riots break out in cities. And in one of the most well-known massacres at that time, we have the Peterloo Massacre of August 1819, which is when the cavalry opened fire on a crowd that were gathered to protest, and in which they killed and injured hundreds. So rather than instigating a need for the police force for safety reasons, and to dull the tools used by the army. It was instead a call for police force providing better protection for the structures of the state, or as Vitali calls it, it was a time for a new economic order of industrial capitalism. Vitali also goes on to say that the new police force was there to, quote, protect property, quell riots, put down strikes and other industrial actions, and produce a disciplined industrial workforce, end quote. So public safety was therefore never an incentive. And that sort of really positions us to the police today and the narrative that we continue to hear, which repeats those lies upon which it was said to have been founded. Now, why is this important in decolonizing the module? So for me, and again, bearing in mind, this is the beginning of my journey, it does a number of things. So first of all, it immediately challenges the knowledge producers that have informed our understanding of modern policing. Now, this is particularly important because the module is entitled Policing and Society. So there's a recognition that policing does not happen in a bubble, but is drawn from wider society. Now, that's important for centralising debates to policing today, debates that will take place during this module, including firstly on examination of how the police work and for whom they work. And a couple of recent examples are important for contextualisation, including Partygate. So despite the publishing of photographic evidence that appeared to show repeated violations of lockdown regulations at number 10 Downing Street, including social events in which the Prime Minister himself was pictured drinking alcohol, it actually took sustained pressure from the public, media and opposition politicians before the Met Police even decided to investigate. And initially they had stated they did not investigate alleged breaches of COVID regulations long after the time they are said to have taken place. Now, eventually 126 fines were handed out, including one to the Prime Minister, his wife, and to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which actually makes it the most fined building in England, contextualised to COVID. There still remains a call for full investigation into the way the Met handled it, including why the Prime Minister was not given a fine for attending one social event at which he's actually photographed drinking alcohol. In contrast, in June 2020, so in the early stages of the COVID lockdown, we've got figures that reveal that the Met Police were handing out twice as many fines to Black people than white for breaking lockdown restrictions. And actually in research carried out by UCL, they found that despite, quote, Black people making up 12% of the population of London, they comprised 31% of arrests, end quote. The Black Police Federation responded by stating that being Black meant ongoing experiences of disproportionality. So examining how the police work and for whom they work is a really important issue to focus on in this module, and it's going to feature as a key debate for the students. Alongside this debate is another one that I feel is equally important, and that pertains to internal police behaviour and their own attitudes, what is often referred to as police culture. And this has grown in significance over the past years, especially with the seemingly endless examples revealing a force characterised by institutional racism and misogyny, as in the pretty awful findings of Operation Houghton that were revealed in February 2022. Now, this was a series of 9 linked investigations that investigated the behaviours of serving police officers and staff at Charing Cross Police Station. The Independent Office for Police Conduct examined the nature of WhatsApp messages shared by, in this case, over 40 police officers, and found that such was the extensive nature of the misogyny and racism within the police force that they could freely send messages on WhatsApp about raping colleagues and partners and bragging about coercive and manipulative behaviour. The IOPC referred to language used as, quote, the normalisation of discriminatory and misogynistic, racist and homophobic language, end quote. And unfortunately, these findings are not isolated to one police station, with other cases demonstrating highly offensive language and behaviours freely communicated through other WhatsApp groups. The murders of Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallwood sadly demonstrate this further, with 2 police officers who were tasked with protecting their bodies and the crime scene following their murders, instead stepping over the crime scene tape, taking photos of the 2 two women, superimposing their own faces onto the bodies and sending to a WhatsApp group where they complained about having to guard, quote, two dead birds. None of those police officers who received the photographs raised concerns with their supervisors. So again, why is this debate important for decolonising the curriculum? Well, actually, just as I was about to present this paper at the conference, Liz Ficchetti of the Institute of Race Relations stated and referred to, quote, the dehumanising mindset and overall sense of impunity and entitlement that these WhatsApp messages by serving police officers displayed. And that quote really stuck with me, this sense of impunity and entitlement. And I think they're useful terms in uniting all of the examples discussed here that demonstrate the structurally embedded nature of power. In relation to policing, impunity and entitlement can be used to refer to both who and how different people are policed and to the very behaviours of those who carry out the policing, seemingly all sharing a belief in both their impunity and entitlement. So all of the above reveals the importance of having an open debate on policing and society, beginning with the history of the Met, contextualised to colonialism and the embedded nature of power, which brings up these important debates that are required today. Positioned to this understanding, it's important as well that the voices of those experiencing racialised and misogynistic policing are heard in the module. Community groups in London who are calling for a different type of policing, including its abolition, will be invited to a public event we hope to hold at LSBU over the next few months. Whilst their own arguments will form a significant part of the module, overlapping with a number of topics, including community policing, police culture, and accountability. And I'm really proud, actually, that within our criminology department, we are committed to decolonising the curriculum and holding these uncomfortable debates with our students. But that also leads to one final point I want to raise, and that's the role of police degree courses and their partnerships with universities. There are currently 44 universities in England offering a police degree course, so effectively recruiting people to the service and gaining funding from it as a result. So whilst the Met and all police forces need to recruit the best candidates representative of communities, and that's obviously said in the absence of a debate about the future of policing, including its abolition, it's vital that we hold open debate and critical analysis, or that it's allowed to take place within the confines of these degree programmes. In just one conversation over the past week, I heard of one student in a university who actually criticised the police force in a module setting and was later sacked from their role as a special in that police force. So decolonising any curriculum means challenging structurally embedded power within society and providing space that creates opportunities to discuss that. And something I feel quite passionate about is this idea that it's a partnership between myself and the students in my module.
Hello everyone, and thanks Mish for inviting me to participate in this Decolonising LSBU discussion. I'm Tim Franson, a freelance web and graphic designer, as well as a technical tutor in web publishing and design at LSBU. This mini presentation is about why type choices matter and how we might start decolonising the technologies we use. In January, I delivered a well-received talk about typefaces at the inaugural LSBU Group Learning and Education Conference. The presentation explored and proposed a collection of inclusive typefaces which could be freely shared with students and used to help create more visually inclusive learning and educational materials. Materials such as handouts, study guides, posters, dissertations, reports, etc. Further, this presentation highlighted that whilst we offer our commitment to decolonising the curriculum and research, we seem to forget to extend these principles to decolonising the technologies we use, such as the word processor, and therefore the documents we produce. The presentation aims to extend our typeface repertoire encourage more discerning and sensitive type choices to start addressing this issue. Firstly, I'll summarise key points from the conference presentation and then highlight further why type choices matter. There is a diversity issue with the design industry, which is echoed in our textual milieu. According to a Design Council report in 2018, the UK design industry is 78% male and 87% white. Next month, a new report will be issued. Hopefully, things will have improved. As type designer Tracy notes, when an industry is dominated by a single race and gender, this not only creates a lack of diversity in peoples and experiences, but ideas and creations as well. This lack of diversity in type choices, in terms of race, ethnicity and gender, manifests in many places, whether it's the omnipresence of Helvetica, which could be seen as a form of visual microaggression, or the default typefaces of the word processors we use every day as teachers and students and professional services staff. As you can see in yellow, here are the default typefaces for OpenOffice, Pages and Word. So we have Times New Roman, Helvetica and Calibri. Notably, the respective type designers listed here on the right are 100% male and 100% white. Regarding Word, Microsoft has recently commissioned 5 new custom fonts as contenders for their next default typeface. The selected design teams working on these fonts again echo the same lack of diversity, comprising 78% male and 89% white type designers, which maps onto the Design Council's findings previously shown. As well as exploring inclusive typefaces in my own teaching practice, here's a couple of example posters which students produced during design workshops for Black History Month and LGBT+ History Month, both making use of typefaces designed by Black type designers. Since the Learning and Education Conference, I've also presented at a BEA, so the School of Built Environment and Architecture Staff Congress, and Nicole Louis, LSBU's Group Chief Operating Officer, has invited me to talk about type choice at a town hall meeting for IT, marketing, estates and other professional services staff. These conversations are very important to start thinking about widening the decolonising agenda beyond curriculum and research to other areas such as IT, marketing, etc. As noted in episode 1 of this series, decolonising our organisation has to be a process of co-creation, and therefore I believe must also include professional services to ensure decolonising is embedded throughout the organisation. Also later this afternoon, I'll be talking with a BA Design for Publishing student from Norwich University of the Arts, who found the January talk fascinating and whose dissertation will focus on gender imbalance within type design. So great to know our institutional conversation is having a wider community reach and impact. Whilst having conversations with students and staff about the importance of type choices, here are some sort of interrelated remarks, pushbacks maybe, I'd like to highlight and challenge. When you choose a typeface, nobody actually cares or knows who designed it. You choose type for aesthetic reasons only. Some fonts appear to be fairly neutral. So let's think about why we should care who designed a typeface, why we should look deeper than surface aesthetics, and why we should be mindful about the idea of typeface neutrality. Put another way, can fonts be racist? Here we have 2 examples that are more obviously problematic. Firstly, we have an example of fractal or black letter used for newspaper mastheads like the New York Times and the Daily Mail, or on the t-shirts of heavy metal bands. However, for many people, especially in Europe and Germany in particular, black letter is most closely associated with one thing: it's the Nazi font used by neo-Nazis today and used during the Second World War, early part of the Second World War, for Nazi propaganda. Next, an example of a so-called chop suey font. Neither the food nor the font bear any real relation to true Chinese cuisine or calligraphy, but have been a typographical shortcut for Asianness for decades and are a crude and potentially offensive. As for the neutrality of type, a warning. So here we've got a typeface called Procyon. Procyon is a well-drawn, seemingly innocuous font designed by Erhard Kaiser. So Kaiser is a public supporter of the openly anti-Islamic organisation Legida, so Leipzig, against the Islamization of the Occident. So clearly fonts can be explicitly associated with racist values. However, we need to be mindful about more hidden associations. You can visit the URL, this web address, to watch the conference presentation recording in full and download the typeface bundle containing Gentium, Montserrat and Marcia. Also at the site there are links to tutorials on how to install and change the default fonts, as well as further reading matter and type resources. I hope you care about type choice and are encouraged to change the default font in your respective word processors, as well as other applications, to help begin decolonising the technologies we use and the media and learning material that we produce. One thing, last thing to mention, I haven't covered Arabic or Ming or Sung typefaces, having focused on the Latin alphabet in today's short presentation. These are clearly important areas to explore to combat the ways in which technology reproduces and represents the ideas and values of the dominant white Anglophone world. Mish will pop this link in the description text below the video, and thanks for listening.
Luke, I've got a question for you. In your presentation, I heard you refer to community of practice, and I'm really interested to explore that a little bit. In that, when you're thinking about your community of practice and embedding it within your course, how do you think it's helping to kind of disrupt the dominant hegemonies, the sort of white centricism in the film lighting industry?
I think maybe using disrupt is a bit strong word, but I would say giving people a space they can really reach out and finding the communities they feel they belong to. After all, there should be different ways to do the same thing. Filmmaking, yes, there's one type of the filmmaking in Hollywood, and then that's probably the one thing people will think that's a real professional. But if you are working in different regions in the world, maybe in Asia, in India, in Africa, or any place that you name it.
Luke, your volume's gone.
Can you hear me now? Sorry,
Yes.
I probably have to just take out my Bluetooth. So let me back to maybe from somewhere started. So I think the filmmaking has has one way that people consider is the better way, which may be the Hollywood style. However, if we're looking into different places, the Africa, Asia, or some places around the world, they will have their own way to do things in order to deal with the situation they encounter. So I guess the community of practice is a way that lets everyone, or the people, students, they really can form their own community instead of lectures giving them the one type of the box and you ask the student to fit in. So I guess from my point of view, it's not only about disrupt, but it's more about like loosen up the very strict or one type, the only methods that we believe is right. However, start to let people have ownership about how they're going to work and how they can build it up, that kind of consensus, so they can have almost like the building up a different nature to learn. And when they go to the real industry, they will have this flexibility to really see and observe, to be more flexible learners throughout their whole career path.
So my question, Tim, for you is, and I was sort of thinking how to phrase this, but how can those typeface choices be acts of resistance to white male centricism? And how do we then share that out, for example, within our whole university, about this typeface resistance?
I think it's about doing, so it's about action from maybe people that are watching this and the other talks, and then communicating it with friends and so forth, and also within professional services to consider it in marketing. So let's say we're designing the logo behind us on our Teams meeting, is to choose a font sensitively. And I think maybe, say for example, the LSBU logo, which is well drawn, and but again, it's designed, so it's Gilroy, and it's designed by Radomir Tinkoff, who he's not sinister, but he is a white male. Again, and I think in terms of that branding, it was a sort of missed opportunity, and it's sort of reflected a bit in, and my suggestion is not to stop using type designed by white men. You know, there are some beautiful typefaces, and choosing those on aesthetics is one of the decisions, but it's also thinking about other reasons we might choose a typeface. And one, it encourages conversation beyond it's just pretty, which it's kind of that's the end of that conversation. I like the look of it, and then it's okay, great. It's kind of what are the more layered things. So I chose that typeface because it's say for example, I might say to students it's always good to consider the type you choose in context with the sort of media you might be sort of making. So one might choose Ariel for a publication about women designers because it was a typeface designed by a woman, Patricia Saunders, for example, rather than I chose that typeface because it's pretty, or perhaps I should have, because this is a document about women designers. Perhaps I should have thought about that rather than using Helvetica, which is designed by a chap, you know. So I think it's about conversations, and I think I said in my presentation, beyond just the curriculum. So and getting people excited about this type that surround us. You know, there's a really nice little application which it's called What the Font, and it's an application on your phone, and you can point it at some type and take a photo, and it tells you what the typeface is, and then you can start investigating it. So you can have a little wander around your built environment and do a little survey yourself and go, perhaps the signage in this building should be changed, so that might be something estates might want to look at, and so I hope that answers so it's about chatting, I think, and then doing, I think, as well as a result.
Yeah, thank you. I think, yes, that kind of action as resistance, as transformation, as moving forward is very core to the decolonizing methodologies, definitely. Thank you for that. Thank you.
So the focal the one particular VTC vocal type company is so that's Trey Seal's Foundry, and which I mentioned in the main presentation, and so his type designs are based on protest placards. And that's where he draws his inspiration. So that idea of activism and pulling that into the visual sphere. So, yeah.
Thank you. Tracy, how were the minoritized students involved in developing your course?
The most important things, it also fits in with my research, is that you don't essentialize them all. I have a lot of black students in my classroom who want to join the police. But I think what's really important is that they become critical friends of the police, if you like, if they want to join them. I think something that, Esme mentioned, which I think is really important, is that sometimes we see the students as like these transient beings that come into the classroom, we teach them, then they leave, and we don't recognise that there are connections between what is, one of the reasons we're decolonising the curriculum. We don't recognise that the same demands and the same demand that is being made for us to decolonise the curriculum is exactly what they're living with outside. But I remember sort of speaking to a couple of students, and even within London, they lived in very different parts of London, and they were talking about parts of the city that they would never go to, and that was based upon racialised lines, actually. But it's also really important to understand that, lived experiences are individual to students. So, yes, we're talking about minority groups, we're talking about decolonising it with a focus on certain communities. But I also think, as Esme said as well, the really important thing is we're focusing on structural inequalities. So there are links to be made between students, whether they're identified as minority or not. And the key to that is recognising the individuality of every student, because they all come in with very different experiences, with very different identities that ebb and flow in importance. So for me, it's about taking on and trying to disperse power in multiple sites effectively.
Thank you. It makes me think about, there are sort of so many different approaches, like the inclusive framework, the social justice framework, and then the decolonizing framework, and they're different. And I sometimes think, that maybe decolonizing doesn't get the clarity of understanding that social justice and inclusive curriculum has.
For me as well, it's like this idea that, there is a lot of focus on decolonising the curriculum. And yeah, it's really important. But you know, we need to decolonize the whole of society. You know, the inequalities or the discourses or the truths that are being pushed within the classroom are exactly those that sit outside of the classroom. And unfortunately, until, you know, those in greater positions of power identify this, we are almost swimming up, you know, against the tide, if you like. But we still have this huge responsibility to our own students, you know, particularly LSBU, you know, with their, you know, representing such a wide, you know, variety of, you know, of qualities, I would say. Yeah,
I hear you. And I think all of those curriculum approaches actually acknowledge that there's a bigger machine than just the curriculum, that, you know, education is political, knowledge is political, as Maria said before, and we have to get into that as well. Thank you all for giving me your time and coming and discussing the decolonizing activities that you're doing in your fields. And I just want to start by saying decolonizing or decolonization is political, is anti-colonial yardstick, is anti-fascist, is anti-oppression, and much more. It also centers the minoritized, not to problematize them, but it also discusses reparations as well. How do we reconcile and repay for the harms that are being done to minoritized individuals and groups? And there's that center of decolonization. It is around justice and it is around equity. I'm going to go to a quote from the 2012. I'm going to go to a quote on page 3 from the 2012 seminal paper by Tuck and Young titled "Decolonization is not a metaphor." Start quote. When we write about decolonization, we are not offering it as a metaphor. It is not an approximation of other experiences of oppression. Decolonization is not a swappable term for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. Decolonizing doesn't have a synonym. End quote. By metaphorization of decolonizing, it sets up possibilities to evade the hard labor, to center the minoritized groups and collaborate with them to deliver anti-racist, anti-discriminatory, equitable and just, and for us here, curricular delivery and university culture, practices and processes. Professor Maya Angelou states, "When you know better, do better." We have known of racism and discrimination for minoritized groups, which has led to widening disparities and disadvantages for people from minoritized groups for too long. LSBU has started on the decolonizing path, and we need to not only keep going, but developing, reviewing, reframing, and rebuilding. Thank you everyone for your time. It's much appreciated.